You want my last $4.50? Fine, but I'm buying at that man's breakfast first. Arthur Higgins said those words to a diner full of frozen, terrified people, with a Hell's Angel standing 6'4" behind him, tattoos climbing his neck like vines. Arthur was 78 years old. He had nowhere to sleep that night. He had Martha's photograph in his breast pocket and an eviction notice folded in his shoe. And he spent his last dollar on a stranger who scared everyone else to death. This is that story. If something in this moves you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this old man's story travels. The diner was called Patty's. It had been called Patty's for 31 years, and Arthur Higgins had been coming in for 28 of them. Back when Martha was alive, they'd sit in the corner booth every Sunday morning, the one by the window, with the crack running up the lower left pane that Patty kept saying she'd get fixed and never did. Martha would order the Eggs Benedict and pick at half of it, and Arthur would finish what she left. And they'd sit there for 2 hours reading the same newspaper and not talking much because they didn't need to. That was the thing about 51 years of marriage. After a while, the silence becomes its own language. Martha had been dead for 14 months. Arthur hadn't sat in the corner booth since. He came in through the front door at 7:42 in the morning on a Thursday in November, and the cold came in with him. He had on his army jacket, the olive drab one with the 25th Infantry patch on the left shoulder and a flannel shirt underneath, and his boots that had a slow leak in the left sole so that his sock was always a little damp by mid-morning. He had 78 years on his body, and it showed not in weakness exactly, but in the careful, deliberate way he moved the way a man moves when he's learned that the world doesn't slow down for you just because your knees are asking it to. He slid onto the stool at the counter, not the booth, never the booth, and set his canvas bag down at his feet. Patty herself was behind the counter. She was 63, built like someone who had been lifting commercial coffee urns for 4 decades, which she had, and she had a face that had seen enough of life to stop being surprised by most of it. She looked at Arthur, and she saw something in his eyes that made her put down the rag she was holding. "Arthur," she said. "Coffee." "Please," he said. She poured it without asking how he took it. She'd known for 28 years. He wrapped both hands around the mug. His hands were shaking, and it wasn't entirely from the cold. He'd been awake since 3 in the morning, sitting in what had been his house for 22 years, reading and rereading a piece of paper that a process server had handed him 9 days ago. He had read it so many times he could recite it. He had read it hoping that the words would rearrange themselves into something that made a different kind of sense. They never did. Notice of foreclosure and eviction. You are hereby required to vacate the premises at 412 Sycamore Lane, Basto, California, no later than 7 a.m. on the date of November 14th. Today was November 14th. He had left the house at 6:45. He hadn't wanted to watch them come. His canvas bag held one framed photograph of Martha taken in 1987 at their daughter's college graduation. One wool scarf, dark green, that had been Martha's. His discharge papers from the United States Army folded into a Ziploc bag, a change of socks, his blood pressure medication, a paperback copy of For Whom the Bell Tolls that he had read 4 times and intended to read again, and his wallet, which contained his library card, a photograph of his grandson Tyler taken 7 years ago, and $4.50. He sipped the coffee. It cost $2.25. He had done the math. Patty watched him from the far end of the counter and didn't say anything. She'd heard because in a town the size of Basto, things got heard. She knew about the reverse mortgage. She knew about Richard Croft. She knew what had happened to Arthur Higgins, and the knowing of it sat in her chest like something she couldn't quite swallow. She started to say something she would never be entirely sure afterward what she was going to say, and then the door opened. The sound preceded him. It was the sound of a motorcycle engine cutting off, and then boots on pavement, and then the door swinging wide, and then the bell above it jangling with what seemed like more force than a bell that size should be able to produce. And then Brick Dawson was inside. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, and he weighed by his own account 260 pounds, though people who stood near him tended to feel like the number was higher. He had a beard that was more gray than black now, though nobody had ever told him that, and tattoos that began at his knuckles and disappeared up under the sleeves of his leather cut and, as would become known, continued from there across most of the available real estate on his torso and upper arms. The cut said Hell's Angels across the back in the kind of lettering that meant something specific to people who knew what it meant. He wore boots that had steel in the toe. He carried himself the way large men carry themselves when they have never once in their adult lives felt the need to make themselves smaller. The diner went quiet. It went quiet in the way that a room goes quiet when the thing that enters it is the thing that the lizard part of your brain has been quietly monitoring the perimeter for. It wasn't a polite quiet. It was the quiet of people becoming very interested in whatever was directly in front of them that wasn't the door. A young couple in the booth nearest the entrance both found reasons to look at their phones. The man at the counter, 2 stools down from Arthur, picked up his coffee mug and set it down without drinking from it. Behind the serving window, the sound of the kitchen, the sizzle and the clatter continued, because Jimmy, the short order cook, hadn't seen who came in yet. But out front, the air had changed. Brick Dawson walked to the counter and sat down 3 stools from Arthur. He pulled off his gloves. His hands, Arthur noticed, were enormous, and the knuckles were mapped with scars in the way that knuckles get when they've spent time in contact with things that push back, and he set them on the counter, and he looked at Patty. "Coffee," he said, "black, and I'll take the full breakfast. Eggs, bacon, the works." His voice was like a truck downshifting. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Patty's hand, Arthur noticed, was not entirely steady when she reached for the coffee pot. She poured the cup without speaking. Her eyes went briefly to Arthur's, and in that look was a message that Arthur read clearly. "Please don't do anything. Please, just be invisible. Please." Arthur looked at his own coffee. He thought about Martha. He thought about a morning that must have been 1974, maybe 75, when they'd been driving back from Fresno, and they'd stopped at a gas station because the car was overheating, and there'd been a man there bigger than Arthur, meaner looking, with a hot anger in his eyes, and everyone at that gas station had been stepping wide around him. And Martha had walked right up to him and said, "Sir, are you all right? You look like you could use some water." And the man had stood there for a moment with his mouth working, and then something in him had just let go. He'd sat down on the curb and drunk the water and told them his dog had died that morning. "Everyone is carrying something," Martha used to say. "You just can't always see what it is." Arthur looked up from his coffee. He looked at Brick Dawson 3 stools down, who was staring at the counter with the expression of a man who was either thinking hard about something or working not to think about anything at all. And Arthur noticed, because he was old enough and had seen enough of the world to notice things that younger people missed, that the big man's jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with the room around him, that his hands wrapped around the coffee mug were gripping it a little too hard. The breakfast plate arrived. Patty set it down without making eye contact and moved quickly to the far end of the counter. The full breakfast at Patty's was $7.95. Arthur looked at his wallet, $4.50. He looked at the breakfast plate in front of Brick Dawson. And Arthur Higgins made the decision the way he had made most of the important decisions in his life, not after extended deliberation, but in the space between one breath and the next, because the thing was either right or it wasn't, and all the thinking in the world wasn't going to change that. He picked up his wallet. He counted out his $4.50, 4 singles and 2 quarters, and he slid off his stool. He walked the 3 steps down the counter, and he set the money down next to Brick Dawson's plate, and he said in a voice that was quiet but entirely clear, "That's toward your meal, son. A man ought to start his day with a decent breakfast." The diner did not breathe. Brick Dawson looked at the money. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned his head slowly and looked at Arthur. Up close, the man was even larger than he'd seen from 3 stools down. His eyes were dark brown, and they were not the eyes of a man who was accustomed to being surprised. But he was surprised now. Arthur could see it. It moved across the man's face like weather. "Old man," Brick said, and his voice was very careful, very level. "What are you doing?" "Buying you breakfast," Arthur said. "Partly. I can pay for my own breakfast." "I expect you can. That's not the point." Brick's eyes moved from Arthur's face down to the money and back up. Something was happening behind those eyes. Arthur wasn't entirely sure what it was. "You know who I am," Brick said. "I know what's on your jacket," Arthur said. "I know the whole diner just held its breath when you walked in. And I know that when a room full of people decides a man is a monster before he's said a single word, it's a lonesome feeling. I've been on the wrong end of that look. Different circumstances, but I know the feeling. Silence. Then Brick said, Vietnam. 68 to 70, Arthur said. Cu Chi District, 25th Infantry. Something shifted in Brick's expression. It was not softness exactly. It was more like recognition. The way a man's face changes when he hears something in a foreign language that he understands. My uncle, Brick said after a moment. Same theater. He never talked about it either. We generally don't, Arthur said. A beat. Arthur started to turn back toward his stool. Hey, Brick said. Arthur stopped. What's your name? Arthur Higgins. Brick nodded slowly. He looked at the $4.50 still sitting on the counter. Then he said, Sit down, Arthur. Let me buy you breakfast. I appreciate that, Arthur said, but I am all right with my coffee. You haven't eaten this morning. It wasn't a question. Arthur didn't know how the man had read that, but he had. He had read it the way men read each other when they've both been in places where reading people correctly was not a social skill, but a survival one. I'll eat later, Arthur said. When Arthur didn't answer, he sat back down on his stool and picked up his coffee with both hands. Brick looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork and he ate his breakfast, and he didn't say anything more. But he left Arthur's $4.50 sitting on the counter, and when Patty came back, he ordered a second breakfast, eggs toast, the whole thing, and said quietly, For my friend down there, don't tell him it was me. Patty looked at him. He'll refuse it, Brick said, so just bring it. And Patty, who had been running this diner for 31 years and who had seen a considerable variety of human behavior, in that time found herself blinking a little more than usual as she went back to the serving window and called the order through. Arthur was looking at his coffee when the plate arrived in front of him. He looked at Patty. I didn't order this. Compliments of the house, Patty said, and her voice was perfectly steady because she had had a lot of practice at keeping her voice steady. Arthur looked at the plate. He looked down the counter at Brick Dawson, who was reading something on his phone and not paying any apparent attention. He picked up his fork. He ate. And for about 10 minutes in a diner in Basto, California, two men who the world had put on opposite ends of every possible spectrum sat at the same counter and had breakfast and didn't say anything to each other. And the diner, which had been braced for something entirely different, slowly, cautiously let the air back into itself. The young couple in the booth went back to their conversation. The man, 2 stools down, finished his coffee. Jimmy's radio in the kitchen clicked on and played a song that nobody in the front remembered the name of later, but that was there underneath everything. The way ordinary life is always underneath the extraordinary moments that interrupt it. Arthur finished the last of his eggs. He set down his fork. He had Martha's scarf in his canvas bag, and he could feel it there, the way you feel things that belong to people you love, not through your hands exactly, but through something older than hands. He reached into his breast pocket and touched the photograph. Just touched it. I'm all right, Martha, he thought. I'm all right. He had 45 minutes. He had approximately 45 minutes before Richard Croft's people showed up at 412 Sycamore Lane to change the locks and declare it no longer his. In those 45 minutes, he had eaten a breakfast he hadn't expected in a diner that had been his only remaining ritual, and a man that the room had been afraid of had, without a word of acknowledgement, made sure he wasn't hungry. Arthur counted this quietly and carefully as a good thing. He counted it against the other ledger, against the 9 months since Richard Croft had called him with the voice of a helpful man and explained that the reverse mortgage terms had adjusted, that there were fees he hadn't been told about, that the equity he thought he had was gone, that the house where he and Martha had raised 2 kids and buried a dog and argued about the thermostat and grown old together, was no longer technically his. He counted the breakfast against all of that. It didn't balance. Nothing would balance that. But it was something. He put on his coat. He picked up his canvas bag. He set 2 quarters on the counter for Patty, which was all he had left, and then he thought about it and set them back in his wallet because he was going to need them for something, though he didn't know what yet. He stood up. Arthur. It was Brick Dawson's voice. Arthur turned. The big man was still sitting at the counter. He had a phone in one hand face down now, and he was looking at Arthur with an expression that Arthur couldn't entirely read. It was not quite concern. It was something more watchful than that. You got somewhere to go, Brick said. Arthur held his canvas bag a little tighter. I'll find somewhere, he said. He walked out of Patty's diner into the cold November air, and the bell above the door jangled behind him, and that was that. He did not look back. He did not see Brick Dawson set down his coffee, pull out his phone, and make a call. He did not hear what was said. He walked south on Main Street toward Sycamore Lane, toward the house that was no longer his, with $4.50 and a photograph and a wool scarf, and 51 years of a life that had been taken apart one bureaucratic document at a time, and the cold pressed against him from all sides, and his left boot leaked, and his knee ached, and the sky was the color of old pewter, low and flat and without mercy. And somewhere in him, underneath the grief, underneath the exhaustion, underneath the cold, in the part of him that had survived Coochie and 2 tours and the death of his son in 1994 and the death of Martha 14 months ago, somewhere underneath all of that, Arthur Higgins was still entirely, stubbornly, indestructibly himself. He had been walking toward impossible things his whole life. He supposed he wasn't finished yet. So, behind him in the parking lot of Patty's Diner, a phone rang twice. A voice answered. Brick Dawson spoke 4 sentences. He listened. He said one more thing. He said, "Find out who Richard Croft is." Then he went back inside and paid the bill. All of it. He left a 40% tip. And he sat at the counter for another 20 minutes, not eating, not reading his phone, just sitting. Just waiting for something he hadn't quite named yet to tell him what he was supposed to do next. Chapter 10. Arthur was 3 blocks away when the eviction crew pulled up to 412 Sycamore Lane. He heard the trucks. He didn't turn around. He just stopped walking for a moment there on the sidewalk, his hand pressed flat against his chest where Martha's photograph was, and he stood very still until the sound of the doors slamming and the men calling to each other faded into the ordinary noise of the street. Then he kept walking. He did not know where he was going. He just knew he wasn't stopping. Arthur had been walking for 20 minutes when his knee gave its first serious warning. Not the usual ache, not the low-grade complaint it had been making for the last decade. This was the sharp, bright kind of pain that says, stop, the kind a younger man might have listened to. Arthur adjusted his canvas bag on his shoulder and kept moving. He had nowhere specific to go. That was the truth he was carrying now, alongside everything else heavier than in the bag, heavier than the cold time. Nowhere specific. He had a daughter, Carol, down in San Diego, but calling Carol meant explaining. And explaining meant hearing her voice do the thing it did when she was trying not to cry, and he couldn't carry her grief on top of his own. Not today, not yet. He had a friend, Don Paulson, from the VFW hall, but Don had a bad heart and a wife who worried, and Arthur wasn't about to knock on that door at 8 in the morning with everything he owned in a canvas bag. He had the library. The library opened at 9. He had 40 minutes. He turned down Millard Street because it was slightly less exposed to the wind, and he was calculating the way men calculate, when calculation is the only tool they have left, where he could sit without being asked to leave, where the warmth would last, longest how many hours the library would give him before he had to figure out the next thing. He was so deep in the calculation that he almost didn't hear the footsteps behind him. Almost. There were 2 of them. He knew it without turning around, the way you know things when you've spent enough time in places where what's behind you matters as much as what's in front. 2 sets of footsteps, young, the rhythm of it was young, loose, unhurried, in the way of people who aren't worried about being caught. He felt the back of his neck tighten. He kept walking. He did not speed up, because speeding up tells them you're scared, and scared is an invitation. Hey, old man. Arthur kept walking. Hey, I'm talking to you. He stopped. He turned around. He looked at them clearly and directly, because he had learned a long time ago that looking away was worse. They were young. That was the first thing. 20, maybe 22. One of them, possibly younger. The taller one had a red hoodie and hands that were already moving, restless fingertips tapping against his thigh in a rhythm that Arthur recognized as someone working up to something. The shorter one hung back slightly, which meant the taller one was the one to watch. You got money, Red Hoodie said. I got $4.50, Arthur said, and I need it. Give it here. Son, don't. The word came out sharp, heated. Don't call me son. Give me the bag. Arthur looked at him. He looked at the real thing underneath the performance. The hunger in it, not for the bag, but for the feeling of the bag changing hands, for the brief sensation of having taken something from someone who couldn't stop you. He had seen it before. He had seen versions of it in places far more dangerous than Millard Street, Basto, California on a Thursday morning in November. "This bag," Arthur said, "has a photograph of my wife in it. She's dead. There's a scarf she wore. There's my discharge papers from the United States Army. I am a 78-year-old man who was evicted from his house 40 minutes ago, and I have $4.50 and nowhere to sleep tonight." Red Hoodie stared at him. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," Arthur continued, and his voice was entirely steady. "I'm telling you so you know exactly what you're taking if you take it. Because you should know. A man should know what he's doing." A long pause. The shorter one in the back had gone very still. Red Hoodie's jaw worked. Something moved across his face. It was brief and it was real. And it was the part of him that was 20 years old and hadn't yet finished becoming whoever he was going to be. For just that moment, Arthur could see it. He could see the boy under the performance. Then the moment closed. "Give me the bag," Red Hoodie said, "and the jacket." Arthur held the bag against his chest. He held it the way you hold the things that are the last things. "Please," he said. Not begging, he wasn't begging. It was something quieter than that. "Not the photograph. You can have everything else. Not the photograph." Red Hoodie grabbed the bag. What happened next took about 4 seconds. The bag came away from Arthur's hands. The army jacket, grabbed from behind by the shorter one, who had moved without Arthur hearing him, came off his shoulders. His wallet hit the pavement. His blood pressure medication rolled out and stopped against the curb. The photograph of Martha in its frame tumbled out and landed face up on the sidewalk, the glass cracking across one corner. The green wool scarf unspooled from the mouth of the bag and lay on the ground like something wounded. And then they were running. Arthur stood on Millard Street and watched them go. He stood there for a moment that lasted longer than its actual seconds. Then he bent down slowly with his hand on his knee and he picked up the photograph first. He turned it over. Martha's face looked up at him from behind cracked glass, smiling at something off camera at the graduation ceremony in 1987, where something had made her laugh right as the shutter clicked and she had her head tilted back slightly and she was so completely, entirely herself. "I'm all right," Arthur said to her, out loud. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He picked up the scarf. He picked up the medication, 3 pills on the sidewalk, 2 still in the bottle, and he gathered them all because he could not afford to lose a single one. He gathered what was left on the ground. His wallet was gone. His discharge papers, which had been in the bag, were gone. His paperback Hemingway was gone. He stood up. He put the medication in his shirt pocket. He wrapped the scarf around his neck because without the jacket, the cold was immediate and serious. He held the photograph in both hands for a moment, then tucked it inside his flannel shirt against his chest where it was warm. He had $4.50, which were in his coat pocket, which was gone. He had nothing. He stood on the sidewalk in a flannel shirt in November in Basto, California, with the temperature at 38 degrees, and he had nothing. And the cold that had been manageable with the jacket was now the kind of cold that makes its intentions known immediately, that presses in on all sides and begins its slow, patient work. He started walking again, because that was what there was to do. His body registered the cold in stages. First the hands, then the ears, then a deep settling chill in his chest that was different from the surface cold, that was the kind of cold that settles into old joints and old bones and does not leave easily. He tucked his hands under his arms and bent his head against the wind and walked. He made it to the library at 9:07. The doors were locked. There was a handwritten sign taped to the glass, Lowe's Thursday and Friday staff training. Reopens Monday. Arthur stood at the library door and read the sign twice. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass for a moment. Then he straightened up and turned around and started walking again. He found a bus shelter on Clement Avenue, which was better than nothing. It blocked the wind from the west, which was the direction the worst of it was coming from. He sat on the bench inside the shelter and put his hands between his knees and concentrated on the simple, essential business of maintaining his core temperature, which was what the Army had taught him to think about in the field. Not comfort, not circumstances, just the body's business. What does the body need in the next 10 minutes? Focus on that. His hands shook. He pressed them harder between his knees. A bus came and went. The driver looked at him through the door, and Arthur shook his head and the driver nodded the brief knowing nod of a man who has seen people sitting in bus shelters with nowhere to go and drove on. Another 10 minutes passed. Arthur's thinking was getting slower. He recognized this. He recognized it the way you recognize something you've been warned about, something you filed away as theoretical and which has now become very, very practical. The cold was inside him now, not just outside. His chest hurt. His hands had gone from shaking to a deeper kind of stillness that was not warmth. He could feel himself slowing down at the cellular level, and he thought with the part of his brain that was still operating at full speed, this is a medical problem. This is not a philosophical problem anymore. This is a medical problem. He stood up. He needed to keep moving. He took 3 steps out of the shelter, and the wind hit him like a hand pushing flat against his chest, and his knee went wrong. Not the warning kind, the actual kind, the real failure, and he went down. He caught himself on one hand and one knee. The pavement was very cold under his palm. He stayed in that position for a moment, breathing. Just breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way you do when you need your body to stop panicking and start cooperating. Get up, Arthur. He got up. He stood. He stood fully upright and he looked down the street. There was a gas station about a block and a half away. Gas stations had heat. Gas stations had bathrooms where you could run hot water over your hands. He fixed his eyes on it and started walking toward it with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who has just realized the situation is serious and is responding to that information like an adult. He made it half a block. He was on the sidewalk in front of a closed dry cleaner when the cold reached its first critical threshold. His legs simply stopped cooperating with the message his brain was sending. He sat down, not fell, sat he was that determined on the low concrete step in front of the dry cleaner's door. He pressed himself into the alcove to get out of the wind. He wrapped his arms around himself. He had Martha's scarf around his neck, and he pulled it up over his chin. Okay, he said, out loud to nobody. Okay, think. He thought. He had no money. He had no phone. It had been in the bag. He had no jacket. He had a photograph and a scarf and a bottle of blood pressure medication with some pills loose in his shirt pocket and the address of nowhere. He could call out to someone. The street wasn't entirely empty. There was a woman walking a dog about 40 yards north. There was a delivery truck at the far end of the block. He could call out. Arthur Higgins had been asking the world for help for the first time in 78 years, approximately once every 15 years, and each time it felt like pressing on a bruise. He had asked for nothing in 14 months. He had managed the grief alone and the paperwork alone and the phone calls with the lawyers alone and the slow, nauseating process of understanding what Richard Croft had done to him alone. He had been alone in the way that people are alone when they have lost the one person who made the aloneness feel temporary. But the coal was making decisions for him now. He opened his mouth to call out to the woman with the dog, and then from somewhere down the street to the south from the direction of Patty's Diner, he heard motorcycles. He heard them before he saw them. The sound came up from several blocks away, the deep layered rumble of multiple engines, not one or two, but many moving together. He had heard this sound in movies and on television and had always registered it as a noise associated with things he was not part of. Now it was simply a sound getting louder. Arthur pressed further into the alcove, partly from instinct, partly from the cold. He watched the street. The first one came around the corner onto Clement Avenue, then 3 more, then 2 more, then a van white, the kind that contractors use unmarked, and then 4 more motorcycles behind the van. They came slowly, not the racing speed of men going somewhere, but the deliberate pace of men looking for something. Arthur watched them come down the block. He watched them slow. He watched them stop. He watched the lead rider, a big man on a black bike engine, idling, take off his helmet. And Arthur from inside the alcove saw the face, the beard, the dark brown eyes now scanning the sidewalk with a focus that was not casual. Brick Dawson was looking for him, the man they'd been afraid of in the diner, the man the room had gone quiet for. He was on Clement Avenue at 9:34 in the morning, leading 8 motorcycles in a van, and he was looking for Arthur. One of the other riders, younger with a red bandana under his helmet, called out, "Brick, there!" And Brick turned his head and his eyes found the alcove and found Arthur sitting on the step with his arms wrapped around himself in his flannel shirt and no jacket and his hands the wrong color and something moved across Brick Dawson's face that was fast and hard and entirely without performance. He swung off the bike before it had fully stopped rocking. He covered the distance between the bike and the alcove in maybe 4 strides, and he crouched down in front of Arthur, this enormous man crouching down to eye level, and he said in a voice that was careful in the way you're careful when you're trying not to communicate alarm, "Arthur, how long have you been out here like this?" "I'm fine," Arthur said. His voice came out wrong, thicker than he intended, slower. "You're not fine." Brick already had his jacket off. He dropped it around Arthur's shoulders. It was like being draped in something warm and heavy and substantial, like being covered by a decision someone had made without asking you. "Your lips are blue. Look at me. What happened to your jacket?" "It was taken." "What?" "2 boys on Millard Street." Arthur paused. His thinking was still slow. "They took the bag too. I kept the photograph." Brick was very still for exactly 2 seconds. Arthur felt something happen in the big man's stillness that he recognized from a long time ago, from a context he didn't want to remember, the quality of a man absorbing information that is making him want to do something and making the decision not to yet. "The photograph," Brick said. "Martha." "You remembered her name?" "I remember everything you told me." Brick put his hand carefully the way large men touch fragile things against Arthur's wrist. Checking. Just checking. Then he stood up and turned toward the van and said loudly and with no wasted words, "Get the blankets, coffee from the thermos, now." The side door of the van slid open. 2 men climbed out, moving quickly. One had a wool blanket, the kind that is serious about warmth, and he brought it to Brick, who wrapped it around Arthur over the jacket. The other man had a thermos and a cup, and he poured and handed it down, and Arthur took it in both hands, and the warmth of the cup against his palms he had no word for it. It was the word before gratitude. It was something that lived below language. "Drink it," Brick said. Arthur drank. Around them, the others had gotten off their bikes. They stood in a loose perimeter, not crowding, not pressing in, but present, just present. 8 men in leather cuts with their engines idling behind them, and a 78-year-old man on a concrete step with a blanket around him and a cup of coffee in his shaking hands, and the morning going on around all of them, as mornings do, indifferent to the significance of what was happening inside it. Arthur drank the coffee. The warmth began somewhere in his sternum and moved outward from there. Brick crouched again, level with him. "I need to know something," Brick said, "and I need you to answer straight with me." "All right," Arthur said. "The reverse mortgage. The man who took your house. What's his name?" Arthur looked at him. "Richard Croft." "And where does he operate out of?" "He's got an office on Palmer Street, Croft Financial Solutions." Arthur paused. "Why?" Brick's expression was not angry exactly. It was resolved. There is a difference, and Arthur, who had seen both, knew which one this was. "Because," Brick said, "a man shared his last $4 with me this morning when he had absolutely no reason to, and about 17 reasons not to. And that means something. That means something to me specifically." Arthur looked at him. "You can't just—" "I know what I can and can't do," Brick said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was completely serious. "What I'm asking you to do right now is get off this step and get in the van where it's warm, because you are a Vietnam veteran who's been sitting in 38 degrees without a jacket for I don't know how long, and that is not a situation I am willing to watch continue." Arthur looked at the van. He looked at the coffee in his hands. He looked at Brick Dawson crouching on a sidewalk in Bastow, California, with his jacket around Arthur's shoulders, asking him to trust the thing he was being offered. "I don't take charity," Arthur said. It came out quieter than he meant it. "This isn't charity," Brick said. "This is a debt." He held Arthur's gaze. "You paid forward this morning. I'm collecting it on your behalf. That's different." Arthur sat with that for a moment. "Martha would have liked you," he said finally. She had a weakness for stubborn men. Something almost not quite, but almost like a smile moved at the corner of Brick Dawson's mouth. "Can you stand it?" he said. "I can always stand," Arthur said. He stood. It took a moment. It took everything he had, not because his body was fully cooperating, but because a Higgins stands under his own power, and that was a policy that was not open for revision. He stood. Brick walked beside him to the van, not touching, not guiding, just there. Just present, just in case. The others stepped back to make room, and nobody said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said better. Arthur climbed into the van. The heat inside was immediate and serious, and it pressed against him like a presence, and he closed his eyes for just a moment, just one moment, and he held Martha's photograph through his flannel shirt, and he felt the cold beginning slowly to give ground. Brick closed the van door. He turned to the man nearest him, the one with the red bandana, and he said something low and quick that the others heard and responded to without question, the way men respond to a voice that has earned their response over years. Then he got back on his bike. The van pulled out. The motorcycles arranged themselves around it, not escorting exactly, but surrounding. Present, they moved through Basto. And in the warmth of the van, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like motor oil and something almost like cedar, Arthur Higgins held his wife's photograph and let himself be carried somewhere. For the first time in 14 months, he let someone else carry something. It was the hardest thing he had done all day. And it was, though he didn't know it yet, the beginning of the part where things began to turn. The van drove for about 15 minutes before it stopped, and Arthur didn't ask where they were going. He sat in the warmth with the blanket around him and the coffee in his hands, and he focused on the simple, essential task of getting his body temperature back to a number that wasn't dangerous. His hands had stopped shaking by the time they turned off what sounded like a main road onto something rougher. The feeling was coming back into his fingers in that painful pins and needles way that means the blood is returning to places it had begun to abandon. He welcomed the pain. Pain meant things were still working. The man sitting across from him in the van had introduced himself as Dex. He was maybe 45 with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, and eyes that were quiet and watchful in the way of men who have learned to observe more than they speak. He had handed Arthur the coffee and the blanket without ceremony, and then sat back and looked at his phone, giving Arthur the dignity of not being stared at while he recovered himself. Arthur appreciated that more than he could have articulated. When the van stopped and the door slid open, Dex said simply, "We're here." Here was a property that Arthur understood immediately was the clubhouse, not from any visible signage, but from the quality of the space, the way it had the particular settled-in feeling of a place that belongs to a group of people who have been using it long enough to stop noticing it. There were bikes everywhere, some clearly mid-repair, and voices coming from inside and the smell of something being cooked. Arthur climbed out of the van, and Brick was already there, jacket back on, watching Arthur's face with that same watchful quality he'd had since the diner. "You need to eat something real," Brick said, "and I need to hear everything." "You already heard most of it," Arthur said. "I heard a summary. I need the details." A pause. "The kind that hold up." Arthur looked at him. "Why does it need to hold up?" "Because," Brick said, "what I'm thinking about doing requires that I know exactly what was done to you and exactly how it was done, so I don't make mistakes." He said it with the calm of someone discussing logistics, as if what came next was simply a problem with steps, and the steps were already being arranged in order. Arthur followed him inside. The interior was loud and warm, and full of men who stopped talking when Arthur walked in, not with hostility, with the particular attention of people who have been told something is coming and are now seeing it arrive. Arthur walked through it the way he walked through everything, with his spine straight and his chin level, because that was who he was and the circumstances hadn't changed it. Brick led him to a table at the back, away from the main group, and sat down across from him. A woman Arthur hadn't seen before, somewhere around 50, with the efficient movements of someone who has never had patience for the unnecessary, set a plate in front of Arthur without asking. Eggs, toast, real coffee in a real mug. Arthur looked at it and felt a particular complicated gratitude of a man who is not accustomed to being taken care of and does not have the energy right now to resist it. He ate. Brick waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things Arthur was already understanding about him, that his stillness was not absence, it was preparation. When Arthur set down his fork, Brick said, "Tell me about the mortgage." Arthur told him. He told him all of it in the careful, sequential way that he had organized it in his mind over 9 months of trying to understand what had happened to him. He told him about the call from Croft Financial Solutions that had come 18 months after Martha died, when Arthur was still navigating the fog of that loss, still in the phase where days ran together, and the mail was something that piled up rather than something that got answered. He told him about the representative, a man named Dale, who had a pleasant voice and a gift for making complicated things sound simple, who had explained that with the rising costs of home maintenance and property taxes, Many seniors in Arthur's situation found that a reverse mortgage adjustment could provide financial stability. He told him about signing papers that he had read because he was not a stupid man, but that had contained language that was designed to be readable without being comprehensible. He told him about the fees, the adjustment fees, the insurance escrow fees, the maintenance assessment fees, the fees that came out of the equity he had built in that house over 22 years quietly and regularly, the way an infection works before you know it's there. He told him about the second call 6 months later, when the numbers had changed, and the third call when they changed again, and the moment he had sat down with a legal pad and done the arithmetic and understood that the equity was gone. All of it. 22 years of equity, gone in 18 months through a mechanism he had agreed to without understanding that he was agreeing to it. He told him about the lawyer he'd consulted who had looked at the papers and told him the language was technically legal, aggressively structured, and deliberately difficult to challenge. He told him about the legal aid office that had a 6-month wait list. He told him about the letters he had written to the county, to the state housing authority, to his congressman's office. The responses, which were variations on "we understand your concern and are looking into this matter." He told him all of it without self-pity, in the flat, factual tone of someone who has already done all the grieving that the story deserves and is now just reporting it. When he finished, the table was quiet. Brick sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, looking at a point somewhere near the middle of the table's surface. His jaw was tight. His breathing was controlled in the way that breathing is controlled when what would come naturally would not be productive. "One question," Brick said. "All right," Arthur said. "Did Richard Croft know?" When he structured it this way, the fees, the language, the whole setup, did he know what he was doing to the people who signed it? Arthur looked at him steadily. "The legal aid lawyer told me she'd seen 5 other cases with the same structure from the same company in 18 months. All of them were widowed or widowered seniors. All of them lost their homes." Brick nodded slowly, just once. "That's what I needed to know," he said. He stood up and walked to the far side of the room where 3 men were waiting. Arthur had noticed them there throughout the conversation, close enough to be available, far enough to be respectful. Brick spoke to them for about 2 minutes. Arthur couldn't hear the words, but he could read the conversation in the posture of the men receiving it, the straightening, the nodding, the quality of attention that meant this is real and this is now. 2 of the men left immediately. The third pulled out a laptop. Brick came back. "I have a guy," he said, sitting back down. "Former real estate attorney. He does work for us now. Different kind of work mostly, but the law part of his brain still functions. He's going to look at everything you signed." "I don't have the papers," Arthur said. "They were in the bag." Brick looked at him. "What was the date of the original mortgage signing?" Arthur told him. "County Records Office has copies of everything recorded against the property. My guy can pull them." A pause. "Also, I need you to think about something. You said 5 other cases, same structure. That's what the lawyer told me. Do you have names?" "No." Brick thought for a moment. Then he said, "Were any of them local Basto or nearby?" She said 2 were in Basto, 1 in Fresno, 2 in Modesto. Brick turned his head and said to no one in particular, but at a volume that carried Danny. From across the room, a younger man, 25 maybe, with the kind of alertness that belongs to people who are good at being summoned, looked up. "Yeah. I need you to find me the other families Croft Financial Solutions took houses from in the last 2 years. Names, addresses, current situations. Everything public record, everything clean." Danny was already moving toward his own laptop. "Give me an hour." "Give me 45 minutes. Danny nodded and sat down and started typing with the focused energy of someone who takes timelines seriously. Arthur watched all of this. He watched a room of men who the world had decided to be afraid of, organizing themselves around a problem with the kind of purpose and efficiency that Arthur recognized from a context no one in this room would have expected him to reference. He recognized it because he had seen it in the Army. Not in the bureaucratic parts of the Army, not in the officers' meetings and the paperwork and the chain of command in the field. In the way men operate when the thing in front of them is real and the response needs to be real, and there is no time for anything that is not directly useful. These men operated the same way. He didn't say this out loud, but he thought it, and the thinking of it changed something in his understanding of where he was. "Brick," Arthur said. The big man looked at him. "What are you planning to do?" Brick considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Short version, he said, We're going to make it impossible for Richard Croft to pretend this is a paperwork problem. We're going to make it a people problem, his specifically. And the longer version, Zoe, involves a conversation I want to have with Croft in person, in his office today. Arthur sat with that. He sat with the image of Brick Dawson walking into Croft Financial Solutions on Palmer Street and felt something in his chest that he couldn't immediately classify. Not comfort exactly, not alarm, something more complicated than either. He'll call the police, Arthur said. He can, Brick said. We're not going to do anything illegal. I want to be clear about that. My lawyer's going to be there. Everything we say to him is going to be things that are legally true, legally documented, and legally his problem. A pause, Joe. We're just going to say them in a way that makes it very clear how seriously we take them. Arthur thought about this. The other families, he said, the ones Danny is finding. If they want to be part of it, they will be. If they don't, they won't. This is about giving people a choice they didn't get the first time. Arthur looked at his coffee mug. He turned it in his hands the same way he'd turned the mug at Patty's that morning that felt like it had happened in a different week, in a different life. My son died in 1994, Arthur said. Brick didn't speak. He waited. Car accident. He was 31. Arthur kept his eyes on the mug. I handled it. Martha and I handled it together, which is the only way I could have handled it, because alone it would have been, he stopped. After Martha died, I kept thinking, who do you handle the unbearable things with after the person you handled everything with is gone? Who carries the other end? The room was very quiet around them now in the way a room goes quiet when the thing being said is the thing underneath everything else. I spent 14 months trying to answer that question by myself, Arthur said. I didn't get very far. Brick's voice when it came was low. No, you don't alone. Nobody does. Arthur finally looked up. Why are you doing this? And don't say it's because of the $4. It's not just the $4. Brick leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands together. My mother was 67 years old when a company very similar to Croft Financial went through her neighborhood in Phoenix. Different mechanism, same result. She lost a house she'd been in for 30 years. I was doing 7 years in Chano at the time and couldn't do a thing about it. His voice was level, but the level was maintained by something the way a levee is maintained by everything built behind it. She died in her sister's spare room 14 months later. The doctor said it was her heart. I know it was her heart, but I also know what broke it. Silence. Arthur held that information. He held it with the care it required. I'm sorry, Arthur said. Yeah, Brick said. Me too. He straightened up, which is why I am very specifically not sorry about what I'm about to go do. He stood. He looked across the room and said, church in 10 minutes. Everyone who's riding today, suit up. The room shifted. The energy in it changed in that fast, particular way that a group of people changes when they have been waiting to move, and the word has finally been given. Men stood. Conversations ended. The space reorganized itself around a purpose. Dex appeared at Arthur's elbow. You stay here, he said, not unkindly. Kira, he nodded toward the efficient woman who had brought Arthur's food, will stay with you. You need anything, she gets it. I want to come, Arthur said. No, Dex said. It's my house. Which is why you're not coming, because the last thing we need is for Croft's lawyers to say this turned into something because you were present and it escalated. You stay here, you're the victim, clean and clear. You come along suddenly, the story gets complicated. A pause. Brick said to tell you, let us be what we're good at. You've been fighting this alone for 9 months. Take the morning off. Arthur sat with that instruction. It pushed against every instinct he had, against the whole architecture of a man who had never in his life let someone else fight what was his to fight. But Dex was right. He could see the logic of it, and it was sound. All right, Arthur said. Dex nodded and turned to go. Dex, Arthur said. The man stopped. He lost his mother to this. Brick did, to the same kind of thing. I know, Dex said quietly. We all know, which is why every man in this room is riding today without being asked twice. He went to suit up. Arthur sat at the table in the warmth and listened to the organized preparation happening around him. The voices, the movement, the sound of engines starting outside. He sat with his hands around his mug and his wife's photograph against his chest, and he thought about Richard Croft sitting in his office on Palmer Street at this moment, probably reviewing files, probably making calls, probably going about a Thursday with no particular awareness that the Thursday was about to change. He thought about the 5 other families, the widows and widowers in houses they had believed were theirs, who had sat with piles of incomprehensible paperwork and done their best to understand what they were agreeing to, and had not been given the truth that would have let them say no. He thought about his son. He thought about Martha. He thought about a woman in Phoenix who died in her sister's spare room. He thought about how interconnected the unbearable things are, how they run below the surface of separate lives like water finding its level. How 2 men sitting in a diner knowing nothing about each other could have underneath all the surface differences the same wound. Outside, the engines were running. Brick's voice over all of them gave a single word. They moved. The sound of it filled the air and then gradually with distance changed and grew smaller, and finally settled into the low vibration of something moving away through the city with a purpose. Arthur felt it in his chest the way you feel bass notes from the inside out. Kira sat down across from him. She set a fresh mug of coffee on the table and her own across from it, and she looked at him with eyes that were practical and kind in equal measure. "They'll handle it," she said. "I know," Arthur said. He was surprised to find that he did know, that he believed it not out of desperation, but out of something that felt against all the evidence of the morning like genuine conviction. "Richard Croft," she said, "has no idea what kind of morning he's about to have." Arthur looked at her, and somewhere in him underneath the exhaustion and the cold that was still leaving his bones in slow increments, and the grief that never fully left in the 14 months of fighting alone, somewhere underneath all of that, something shifted. Something that had been braced against the world, that had been holding its position by sheer stubbornness, found that it didn't have to hold alone anymore. He picked up his coffee. "No," Arthur said, "he really doesn't." And outside, growing fainter now, but still present, still purposeful, the sound of the motorcycles carried across the city toward Palmer Street, toward a man who had built his business on the certainty that the people he took from had no one to stand up for them. He was about to discover how wrong he had been. Richard Croft had been in his office since 8:15, which was early even for him, because Thursday was the day his administrative assistant organized the week's closings, and Richard liked to review them before she arrived. He liked that hour, the quiet of it, the office to himself, the files spread across his desk, the numbers doing what numbers did, when you understood how to arrange them, which was to say they accumulated in the direction you pointed them. He was 54 years old, trim, with the careful appearance of a man who understood that presentation was a form of argument. He wore his suits well. He spoke in the measured, reassuring cadence of someone who had spent years learning to sound like the most reasonable person in any room, because the most reasonable person in any room was the one people signed things for. He had built Croft Financial Solutions over 16 years from a 2-room office and 1 assistant into a regional operation with 12 employees and a portfolio that he had structured quietly and methodically to be nearly impervious to challenge. Nearly. His phone rang at 9:47. It was Dale, his senior representative, calling from the lobby. "Richard," Dale said, and his voice had a quality in it that Richard did not immediately recognize, because Dale was not a man who sounded like this. Dale sounded smooth. Dale sounded managed. Right now, Dale sounded like a man standing next to something he hadn't anticipated. There's a situation in the parking lot." Richard set down his pen. "What kind of situation?" "Motorcycles." A pause. "A lot of motorcycles, and they're not leaving. They're just sitting there, running." Richard went to his window. He looked out. He stood very still for a moment. There were 11 motorcycles arranged across the width of the parking lot engines. Running riders seated, not moving, not speaking, just present. Behind them, a white van. And coming through the front door of the building at that precise moment, 3 men, one of them enormous with a beard going gray and a leather cut in the quality of someone who had spent his life deciding things, and 2 others beside him, one of whom was carrying a leather briefcase that looked considerably more expensive than anything else about him. "Call no one," Richard said. "Richard, I said call no one." He stepped back from the window. "Send them up." He sat back down at his desk. He straightened the files. He was good at this, at taking the shape of calm while reading a situation and calculating its implications and deciding on a response, all simultaneously, all beneath a surface that showed nothing. He had done it in rooms with hostile creditors and aggressive attorneys and desperate homeowners who had finally understood what had happened to them. He was good at managing rooms. The door opened. Brick Dawson walked in, and Richard Croft, who prided himself on reading rooms, spent approximately 3 seconds recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the next hour. The man with the briefcase followed, and behind him Dex, who closed the door and stood in front of it with his arms at his sides and the expression of someone who has been instructed to stand there and intends to do exactly that until further notice. Brick sat down in the chair across from Richard's desk without being invited to. He looked at Richard with the dark brown eyes that were not angry, and this Richard, registered with a professional's instinct, was more troubling than anger would have been. Anger was readable. This was not. "Mr. Croft," Brick said. "I'm sorry," Richard said, and his voice was level-measured, the voice he was paid to deploy. "I don't believe we have an appointment." "We don't," Brick agreed. "This is the kind of conversation that doesn't benefit from scheduling. I'm going to need to ask you to, this is Marcus Webb." Brick nodded at the man with the briefcase who was already opening it, already extracting documents with the practiced movements of someone who had done this before and found it straightforward. "Marcus is an attorney, former real estate litigator, California Bar active license. Would you like to verify that?" Richard looked at Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb looked back at him with the particular expression of an attorney who is holding paperwork and waiting for you to make the decision about how this goes. "Go ahead," Richard said. Marcus set 3 documents on Richard's desk. "These are the recorded mortgage instruments for 3 properties, 412 Sycamore Lane, Basto, 1847 Orchard Drive, Basto, and 291 Fenwick Court, Fresno. All 3 originated through Croft Financial Solutions within an 18-month period. All 3 resulted in foreclosure within 24 months of origination." He paused. "I have documentation for 2 additional properties in Modesto, but we'll come to those." Richard looked at the documents. He did not touch them. "This is a matter of public record," he said carefully. "These transactions were legally executed and—" "They were executed," Marcus said. "Whether they were legal is the question we're currently in the process of answering. What I can tell you is that I've identified a pattern across these 5 properties that is consistent with predatory lending practices as defined under California Civil Code, Section 1916.7, and the Federal Home Ownership and Equity Protection Act." He said it without drama, just facts arranged in order. "I can also tell you that 2 of the former homeowners I've spoken with are prepared to participate in a civil complaint, and that the others are being contacted today." Richard's jaw tightened. It was subtle. Brick saw it. "Additionally," Marcus continued, "I've been in contact this morning with a journalist at the Sacramento Bee who covers consumer financial issues. She's expressed significant interest in the pattern I've described. She was particularly interested in the demographic profile of the affected homeowners." He paused again. "Widowed seniors in their 70s and 80s, all of them in the first 2 years of bereavement. She found that detail noteworthy." The room held its temperature. Richard looked from Marcus to Brick. He was doing the calculation. Richard Croft was always doing the calculation. Arthur had been right about that it was the only thing Richard Croft knew how to do. Everything was a calculation. The question was whether the numbers still worked. "What do you want?" Richard said, flat, direct, because he was a man who, when the social performance stopped being useful, went straight to the transaction underneath it. "Arthur Higgins," Brick said. "Mr. Higgins' foreclosure was legally—" "Arthur Higgins gets his house back," Brick said. "Today. Not next week, not pending review. Today." "That is not how property law," Marcus Brick said. Marcus pulled another document from the briefcase and set it on the desk. "This is a voluntary rescission agreement. It transfers the property at 412 Sycamore Lane back to Arthur James Higgins, clears the outstanding debt the foreclosure was based on, and includes a compensatory payment for emotional distress and wrongful displacement." He let Richard look at it for a moment. "The compensatory figure is on page 3. Richard turned to page 3. Something moved across his face that he controlled immediately, but not quickly enough. "That number," Richard said, "it is negotiable," Marcus said, "within a range. The bottom of the range is still on that page." Richard stood up. He walked to his window. He looked out at the parking lot where 11 motorcycles sat in a line with their engines running and their riders patient and unmoving. He stood there for a moment with his back to the room, and he did what he always did, which was calculate. He calculated the cost of a civil complaint with multiple plaintiffs in a documented pattern. He calculated the cost of a Sacramento Bee story with that demographic detail widowed seniors recently bereaved, and what that story would do to a business built on trust and the appearance of benevolence. He calculated the cost of regulatory attention of the State Housing Authority, deciding to look more closely at the 5 properties and then inevitably at the others. He calculated against the compensatory figure on page 3, which was significant but survivable, and against the house, which was 1 property against a portfolio, and the math was not in his favor. He turned around. "I want a full liability release," he said. "Signed by Higgins, no further civil action." "Mr. Higgins will sign a release specific to this transaction," Marcus said. "It will not cover the other properties. Those homeowners are separate parties and their claims are their own." Richard's jaw worked. That's the offer," Brick said. His voice had not changed in volume or temperature since he walked in. It hadn't needed to. "Arthur Higgins gets his house, gets made whole, and you get to figure out the rest of your situation with people who aren't me." A pause. "Or we walk out, Marcus files a complaint Monday morning, and the Bee runs the story Wednesday. Your choice, and I genuinely don't have a preference." He did have a preference. They both knew he did. But the saying of it, the absolute convincing flatness of it, was its own kind of pressure. Richard Croft sat back down. He looked at the rescission agreement for a long moment. He thought about his mother, though he would have said he didn't the way people think about the things they've buried, not consciously but in the background, always like a frequency you can't turn off. He thought about nothing so self-aware as guilt. He thought about the calculation, and only the calculation, because that was the only language he spoke. And in that language, the answer was clear. He picked up his pen. "I'll need my attorney to review this," he said. "You have 2 hours," Marcus said. "I'll be in the coffee shop across the street. Call me when you're ready." Marcus closed his briefcase. He stood. Brick stood. Dex at the door didn't move until Brick moved, and then he opened the door and they filed out in the order they'd come in, and the door closed behind them. Richard Croft sat alone in his office. He sat there for 3 minutes, not moving, not picking up his phone, not calling his attorney, just sitting with the documents on his desk and the sound of 11 motorcycle engines running in the parking lot below, and the very clear understanding that the calculation had changed, that the numbers had been rearranged by someone who understood them differently than he did, and that the thing he had built on the certainty that his victims had no one, that certainty was no longer available to him. He picked up his phone. He called his attorney. He said, "I need you here in an hour. Bring your review of the Higgins file." He hung up. He sat, and in the parking lot below, the motorcycles waited. Back at the clubhouse, Arthur didn't know any of this yet. He was sitting at the table with Kira, and she had told him 3 things about herself. She had a son in college. She had been running the books for the club for 11 years, and she had once, at the age of 42, decided to learn to ride, and had become, by general consensus, the most technically precise rider in the chapter, which was something nobody had expected, and she had found enormously satisfying. She told him these things because she had the instinct, the good human instinct, for what a man needs when he is sitting and waiting and trying not to think about what he cannot control. Arthur listened. He asked questions. He was genuinely interested because he was a man who was genuinely interested in people, always had been. It was one of the things Martha had loved about him, that he never performed interest. He actually had it. And this woman across from him was interesting. She was sharp and self-possessed and kind without being soft, and she reminded him obliquely sideways of no one specific, but of the general category of person he most respected. His phone, Kira's phone, she'd handed it to him, buzzed at 11:23. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. Kira told him it was Dex's number. It said, "He's signing." Arthur read it twice. He set the phone down on the table. He sat very quietly for a moment with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and he looked at his hands, the age of them, the work in them, the history of them, and he thought about Martha, specifically about the moment in 1991 when they had signed the papers for the house on Sycamore Lane, how she had grabbed his hand after the pen was down and squeezed it hard and said, "We did it." Art with the particular joy of someone who understood what a house means, not as property, but as the physical form of safety, the structure you build a life inside. "We did it, Art." He thought about that moment, and he looked at his hands, and he did not cry because Arthur Higgins was a 78-year-old veteran from the Coochee district, and he did not cry easily. But his eyes were very bright, and Kira, who was watching him, looked down at her coffee and gave him the privacy of not being seen. "He's signing," Arthur said to himself more than to her. "Yeah," Kira said quietly. "He's signing." A pause. "I need to call my daughter," Arthur said. "The phone's yours," Kira said. He dialed Carol's number from memory. It rang twice, and she picked up with a distracted hello of someone in the middle of something, and then she heard his voice, and the distracted quality disappeared immediately. "Dad, are you all right? Why are you calling from a different number?" "I'm all right," he said. "I'm Carol. I need to tell you something." He told her. Not all of it, not the cold and the mugging and the hypothermia. He would tell her those parts later. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd let the story settle into a cleaner shape before he gave it to her. But he told her about the house. He told her that it was going to be his again. She was silent for a long moment on the other end. "Dad," she said. Her voice had the particular texture of someone trying very hard to hold a feeling steady. "How?" "I bought a man breakfast," Arthur said. "It's a long story." She laughed. It came out wet and bright, at the same time the laugh of someone who is crying and laughing simultaneously, which is a specific sound that only people who love someone hard can make. "I'm coming up," she said. "I'm leaving today." "You don't need to." "Dad," he stopped. "I'm coming," she said. "I should have come sooner. I know that. I'm coming today." Arthur held the phone for a moment. He thought about saying, "I'm fine, Carol. You don't need to uproot your week." He thought about the 14 months of fine he had told her, and told himself and told anyone who asked. He thought about the question he'd had, who carries the other end, and the answer that the morning had been assembling, piece by piece from sources he never would have predicted. "All right," he said. "Come." He hung up. He looked at Kira. She was looking at her coffee mug. "She's coming," he said. "Good," Kira said, simply directly. "Good." At 12:47 in the afternoon, Marcus Webb walked back into Richard Croft's office with Brick beside him, and the rescission agreement was signed in the presence of both attorneys and dated and notarized by Richard Croft's own notary, who did it with the expression of someone who understands they are performing a function and not being asked for their opinion about it. Marcus called Brick from the elevator. Brick called Dex. Dex told Arthur. Arthur was standing when they came through the door of the clubhouse because he had known it was coming, and he'd been standing for the last 10 minutes unable to sit. Brick walked across the room, and he set the signed document on the table in front of Arthur, and he said, 412 Sycamore Lane, yours. Arthur picked it up. He read it. He read it all the way through, the way you read something when you need to believe it's real, when you need the reality of it in your hands and in your eyes before the rest of you catches up. His hands were not shaking, but the stillness in them cost him something. He set it down. He looked at Brick. "The other families," Arthur said. Brick nodded. "Danny has names and addresses for 4 of the 5. We're reaching out today. Marcus will take their cases. Croft's release doesn't cover them." "He's going to fight it." "Yes," Brick said. "He is. And they're going to fight back, and they're going to have actual representation, and it's going to take time. But they're not invisible anymore." He paused. "That's the part that matters first, not being invisible." Arthur stood with that. He stood with the weight of it, and the rightness of it, and the sorrow in it, that the first necessary thing was simply to be seen, to have what happened to you acknowledged as something that happened, to have someone stand in a room and say this person exists, and what was done to them was wrong. That this was necessary, that it was not automatic, that someone had to fight to make it true. "Thank you," Arthur said. He said it simply, directly, without elaboration, because there was no elaboration adequate to it. Brick looked at him. "Don't thank me," he said. "You started it." Arthur shook his head slowly. "I bought you breakfast." "Yeah," Brick wavered. "You did, when you had nothing and no reason to." He met Arthur's eyes steadily. "Do you understand how rare that is? Do you understand what that does to a man who has been looked at a certain way his whole life? Who walks into a room and watches people become invisible?" His voice was still level, still controlled, but underneath the level, something real pressed against it. "You looked straight at me. You didn't see the jacket. You saw—" He stopped, reconsidered. "You saw someone who might be carrying something. That's what Martha taught you." Arthur was very still. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "That's what Martha taught me." Outside, someone had cut the motorcycle engines. The parking lot of the clubhouse was quiet in the way it was rarely quiet, and in that quiet, the sounds of the ordinary afternoon came through traffic on the main road. A bird somewhere, the distant mechanical rhythm of a city going about its business, indifferent as ever to the extraordinary things happening inside it. Arthur Higgins had a document on a table in front of him that said his home was his. He had a daughter driving up from San Diego. He had a room full of men who had ridden out that morning on his behalf without being asked twice. He thought about Richard Croft sitting in his office on Palmer Street alone with the calculation that had finally come due. He felt he examined what he felt carefully the way you examine something unfamiliar, and he found that it was not triumph. It was something quieter than triumph. It was the feeling of a debt being acknowledged, of the ledger being corrected, of the world which had been badly out of balance taking one deliberate step back toward level. It was not enough for the other families. Not yet. That was still ahead, still in the work Marcus would do, and the fights that would be fought, and it would be long, and it would be difficult, and it would not be clean. But it was a step, and Arthur knew from 78 years of living that steps were how everything happened. Not in the grand sudden reversal, not in the miracle, but in the one step, and then the next one, and the decision to take it, even when your knee hurt, and your boots leaked, and the sky was the color of old pewter, and you had $4.50 and nowhere to sleep. He picked up the document. He folded it carefully. He put it in his shirt pocket next to Martha's photograph. He buttoned the pocket. "Okay," he said, to Brick, to the room, to himself, to Martha, to all of them at once. "Let's go home." They drove to Sycamore Lane in the van with the motorcycles around them, and Arthur sat in the back holding the folded document in his shirt pocket and said nothing for most of the ride. Dex drove. Brick rode ahead. The city moved past in the particular way it moves when you are inside something important and the world outside doesn't know it yet, casually, indifferently, going about its Thursday afternoon as if nothing had shifted on its axis, which from the outside was true and from the inside was completely false. Arthur knew this street. He had known it for 22 years. He knew the way the pavement buckled slightly at the corner of Millard and Sycamore from a tree root that the city had been planning to address since 2009. He knew the Garcias at number 408. Elena Garcia had brought them tamales every Christmas for 18 years and had cried at Martha's funeral in the particular open, unguarded way of people who are not afraid of being seen to grieve. He knew the Pattersons at 416, who kept their porch light on all night, every night, which Arthur had always privately found comforting, in the way small, consistent things are comforting, the way they say someone is here, someone is awake, someone is keeping watch. The van stopped. Arthur sat for a moment before he moved. He sat with the reality of what was on the other side of the van door. The house. His house. The house where he had carried Martha over the threshold in 1999, when they'd finally saved enough to leave the rental on Clement Avenue, where she had stood in the empty living room and turned in a slow circle with her arms out and her face turned up like she was feeling rain, and said, "Art, this is ours. This is actually ours," with a wonder in her voice that a person who builds things over a lifetime earns the right to feel. The house where his daughter Carol had come home for Christmas every year until the drive got too long, and then the flight started, and even then, every year Christmas. The house where his grandson Tyler had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where Arthur had run alongside him holding the seat and then quietly let go. And Tyler had pedaled 20 feet before he knew Arthur wasn't there anymore, and then turned around with that enormous 7-year-old grin that was all gap where the front teeth had been. The house where Martha died. In the bedroom in the early morning, and the way people die when their body has simply decided it has done what it came to do. Arthur had been asleep in the chair beside the bed, the way he had been sleeping for the last 3 weeks, and he had woken to the quality of the silence and known immediately the way you know the things you are most afraid of knowing without having to verify. He had sat with her for a long time before he called anyone. All of that was inside that house. All of it. And Richard Croft had put a piece of paper between Arthur and all of it, and Arthur had spent 9 months learning what it felt like to be separated from everything that made a life by a piece of paper that had been designed to be inescapable. He had another piece of paper in his pocket now. He opened the van door. He stepped out. The house looked the same. That was the first thing. It looked exactly the same, and for a moment, that simple fact hit him with a force he hadn't anticipated, because he had been afraid somewhere underneath everything that it would look different, that 9 months of being someone else's or no one's would show on it. It didn't. It stood there in the flat November light and looked exactly like itself, and Arthur stood on the sidewalk in front of it and felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for a very long time. He heard the motorcycle engines behind him cutting off one by one until the street was quiet. He walked up the front path. The locks had been changed. He had known they would be. He turned to Dex, who was already there, who had already made a call, who pressed a key into Arthur's hand with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who anticipated what was needed and had arranged for it. "Marcus worked it out with the property manager," Dex said, "this morning while you were eating." Arthur looked at the key. It was a standard house key, new still, with a small plastic tag from the locksmith. He turned it in his fingers. He unlocked the door. He pushed it open. The smell of the house hit him before anything else. Not a bad smell, it had been unoccupied. Not neglected, but the particular layered smell of a house that has held a life that has absorbed decades of cooking and coffee and the specific presence of specific people, and that smell does not leave even when the people do. Arthur stood in the doorway and breathed it in, and he thought, there you are, to the house, to the life inside it, to Martha, who was in the walls of this place the way she was, nowhere else left on earth. He stepped inside. Behind him, he was aware of movement. Brick had come up the path, and Dex and several others stopping at the doorway, not entering, giving him the room to go in first and alone. He appreciated this with a wordless, bone-deep appreciation that he would not have been able to articulate if asked. He walked into the living room. The furniture was there. They hadn't taken the furniture. The foreclosure had been on the property, not the contents, and it was all exactly where it had been. Martha's reading chair by the window, the one with the slightly broken armrest that she kept saying she'd get fixed and never did. The shelf of paperbacks along the east wall, organized by a system that only Martha had fully understood, and that Arthur had never rearranged because he couldn't bring himself to. The lamp on the side table that threw a warm circle of light when it was on, and that Arthur had turned on every evening for 14 months out of a habit so deep it lived below conscious thought. He touched the back of Martha's chair. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the fabric. "All right," he said quietly. "Just that. All right." He turned around. Brick was in the doorway. Just inside it, hat in his hands, he had taken off his bandana and was holding it the way men hold things when they are trying to be respectful and are not entirely sure of the protocol. His big frame filled the doorway, and his expression was the one Arthur had come to recognize as his real expression, the one underneath the managed surface which was serious and attentive and quietly, resolutely human. "It's a good house," Brick said. "It is," Arthur said, a pause. "I need to tell you something," Brick said. He came in, fully let the door close behind him. Dex and the others stayed outside, and again Arthur felt the deliberateness of this, the respect in it. Danny found the other families, all 5. "I told you 4, but he found the 5th this afternoon." "All right," Arthur said. 2 of them already lost their homes, permanently sold before we could get to them during the foreclosure process. They're renting now. One's in an apartment, one's in her daughter's basement." He paused. 3 still have their properties in the legal window where a rescission challenge is viable. Arthur sat down in his own armchair, not Martha's, his, the one across from hers, and he looked at Brick and he said, "What does Marcus say?" "He says the 3 viable cases are strong. The 2 who already lost their properties are harder, but there's a damages claim. He thinks the pattern, all 5 together, is enough for the State Housing Authority to open an investigation into Croft Financial as a business, not just as an individual transaction." Brick sat across from him on the edge of the couch, elbows on knees. "That would be the thing, not the individual cases, the investigation, because that opens the records. And the records will show more than Pia," Arthur said. Brick met his eyes. "That's what Marcus thinks." "Yes." Arthur sat with that. He sat with the size of it. He thought about the 2 families already in apartments, already in daughters' basements, who had signed papers they didn't fully understand in the funk of grief or illness, or simply the ordinary human assumption that a man with a helpful voice in a professional office was not in the process of taking everything from them. He thought about the investigation that would open, the records it would expose, the other names it would find. "Tell Marcus yes," Arthur said. "Tell him I'll be the named plaintiff on whatever he needs. And whatever the other families want to do, I'll support it." You understand it'll take time, Brick said. It could be a year, more. I've got time, Arthur said. I'm home. He said it simply. I'm home. Two words that contained 22 years and one person and everything that made a life, a life. And Brick heard all of it in those two words and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. From outside, Arthur heard a car pull up. He heard a door open and close. He heard footsteps on the front path. Quick, purposeful footsteps, the footsteps of someone who has been driving for 4 hours with their hands tight on the wheel. He stood up. The front door opened without a knock because Carol had a key. She had always had a key, and she came through it with her coat still on and her hair still pulled back the way it got when she'd been driving and hadn't stopped to arrange it. And she looked at her father, standing in the living room of the house she had grown up in, which she had been afraid she would never see him standing in again, and she did not say a single word for a full 3 seconds. Then she crossed the room and she put her arms around him. She was 53 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and a life of her own down in San Diego that she ran with competence and controlled emotion. She held her father in the living room on Sycamore Lane, and she was none of those things. She was just Carol, who was 12 years old the year they moved into this house and who had come home. Arthur held his daughter. He held her the way you hold people when you have been reminded in the specific and brutal way the day had reminded him how quickly everything can change, how little is actually guaranteed, how the ordinary act of holding someone is one of the rarest and most valuable things available to a human being. "I've got you, Dad," she said into his shoulder. Her voice was unsteady in a way he had not heard since 1994, since the call about his son, since the specific register of grief. "I've got you." "I know," he said. "I know you do." They stood there for a long moment. Brick, who was still in the room, looked at the floor with great interest, and his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was feeling something he had decided to hold at a certain distance. Carol finally stepped before him. She looked at her father's face. She looked at the flannel shirt, at the absence of the army jacket. Something moved across her expression. "What happened to your jacket?" she said. "Long story," Arthur said. "Dad." "Carol." He held her gaze. "I'm all right. The jacket isn't the headline." She looked at him for another moment, the look of a daughter reading a father, the look that takes in everything he's not saying alongside everything he is. And then she turned and saw Brick Dawson for the first time. She went very still. Brick stood up. He held his hat in front of him with both hands. "Ma'am," he said. Carol looked at this man the size of him, the leather, the beard, the tattoos visible at his collar and his knuckles. And then she looked at her father, and Arthur watched her do the math with the particular speed of a woman who has been a problem solver her whole life. "You're the one who helped him," she said, not a question. "Your father helped me first," Brick said. "I just returned the favor." Carol looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you drink coffee?" A pause. Something in Brick's expression shifted. The careful management of it dropped away for just a moment, and underneath was something that was unmistakably moved. "I do," he said. "Then sit down," Carol said. "I'm going to make some, and I want to hear all of it." She went into the kitchen. They heard the water running, the familiar domestic sounds of the kitchen being occupied, the coffee maker clicking and starting its work. And those sounds in this house were so specifically themselves, so tied to every morning. Arthur had stood in that kitchen with Martha, that he had to sit down again, not from weakness, but from the fullness of it, from the sheer density of what this particular sound in this particular house meant. Brick sat back on the couch. He looked at Arthur. "She's like you," he said. "She's better than me," Arthur said. "She always has been." The coffee maker ran. The afternoon light moved the way it moves in November early, in slanting, and the house held it, the way it held everything steadily without drama, the way a house holds the life inside it when the life is there to be held. The doorbell rang. Arthur looked at Brick. Brick looked at Arthur. Arthur got up and opened the door. It was Elena Garcia from number 408. She was 71 years old with her coat buttoned to the neck and a ceramic dish covered in foil in both hands. And she looked at Arthur with an expression that contained an entire conversation. Relief, fury on his behalf. The particular love of a neighbor who has watched something unjust happen and been powerless to stop it, and is now at the first available moment doing the only thing that is within her power to do, which was to show up with food. "I saw the lights on," she said. "Arthur." She stopped. Her chin moved. She got it under control. "Arthur, I prayed for this. "I know, Elena," he said. "Come in." She came in. She looked at Brick and didn't miss a beat. She had raised 4 sons and had the steady equanimity of a woman who has seen every variety of human and made her peace with the full spectrum. She set the dish on the coffee table and she said to Brick, "You the one who helped him." "Part of it," Brick said. "God bless you," she said simply and directly, the way she said everything. Then she sat down next to him on the couch as if she had always planned to be there. Arthur stood in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen, and he looked at this, his daughter making coffee in the kitchen of his house, a neighbor on his couch next to a Hell's Angel, the folded document in his shirt pocket next to Martha's photograph, the lamp in the corner throwing its warm circle of light, the shelf of Martha's books exactly where she had left them. He thought about 7:15 that morning. He thought about the diner and the $4.50 and the decision that had taken less than one breath. He thought about how a single act moves through the world, not in a straight line, not cleanly, not without haste, but it moves. It finds the thing it's supposed to find. It calls back something the world had let go of, something that needed calling back. He had not planned any of this. He had not calculated it. He had done the thing that was right because it was right in the specific and unglamorous way that right things usually happen quietly without an audience in the middle of an ordinary morning that was about to become the worst day of his life. And the worst day of his life had become this. The thought of it filled him without quite fitting too large for the container of one afternoon, too improbable for a man who had spent 9 months learning to believe that the world was smaller and meaner than he'd thought. He stood in the doorway of his house and he revised that assessment carefully, with the precision that 78 years entitles a man to. The world was not smaller and meaner. The world was full of unexpected things in unexpected forms. The things you needed sometimes came from the direction you least expected, wearing the face you were most afraid of arriving at the moment you had stopped looking. The coffee was done. Carol came out of the kitchen with 4 mugs. She had counted the people in the room without making a thing of it. She had always been like that, and she set them on the table and she sat down across from her father and she looked at him with Martha's eyes. "Okay," she said, "tell me everything. From the beginning." Arthur picked up his coffee. He wrapped both hands around it. He looked at his daughter and at Elena Garcia and at Brick Dawson sitting on his couch with his hat on his knee and his dark brown eyes steady and attentive. He thought about where to begin. He thought about the diner and the coffee and the moment he had looked at a man the room was afraid of and seen someone carrying something he recognized. He thought about Martha saying everyone is carrying something, you just can't always see what it is. He thought about $4.50 and what they had set in motion. And Arthur Higgins, who was home, who was warm, who had his daughter across from him, and a signed document in his pocket, and a neighbor on his couch, and a man who had ridden out for him in his living room opened his mouth and began. He did not rush it. He did not shorten it. He told it the way it deserved to be told, all of it from the beginning. The whole long, improbable chain of it, the way a life tells itself when it finally has the room and the people to tell it to. Outside, the November afternoon did what afternoons do. The Pattersons' porch light came on at 4:16, right on schedule, steady and constant the way it always was. Traffic moved on the main road. The city went about its business. And on Sycamore Lane, in a house that had been taken and returned, a 78-year-old man sat in his chair and told his story, and the people who needed to hear it were there to hear it. And the light was warm, and the coffee was hot, and the silence that had lived in those rooms for 14 months had finally completely given way. Some debts are paid in money, some are paid in time, some are paid in the kind of stubborn, costly, beautiful decision to see the humanity in a person that everyone else has decided not to see and to act on it with your last $4 in a diner on the worst morning of your life. Arthur Higgins paid that debt at 7:42 on a Thursday morning in November. By afternoon, the world had paid it back with interest in full in the only currency that has ever actually mattered. He was home, and this time no one was taking it from him again.